All right. Without further ado, I'd like to invite to the stage two great folks for our opening Fireside. Hemant Taneja, who's a managing director at General Catalyst, as well as Shuja Keen, who is the president of the club, as well as the managing director of the resource group. Please come to the stage.
All right. Can we have another round of applause for Teddy and Morgan and Daniel and Gail and Jesus? They've done an amazing, amazing job. So excellent work. So as Teddy mentioned, I'm Shuja Keen. I'm the president of the MIT Club of Northern California. We started this conference about 3 years ago. It's come a long way. And the idea was to bring in a multidisciplinary sort of group of folks who are from the academic world, from technology, who are entrepreneurs, who are executives, and then investors, and bring them in a safe environment where you can have a open, frank conversation around emerging technologies without the hype, but just be practical and be real. And look at it from what are the real world challenges, but also opportunities which exist in various sectors, and how do we sort of go out and disrupt those verticals. So we have a really amazing lineup of speakers today, and really excited to see what we have in store. And today I have the pleasure to have join with me in conversation a really dear friend of mine, Hemant Taneja, who I've known for 2 decades or so. Hemant's a managing director at General Catalyst, where he's made series of successful investments, including in Livongo, Applied Innovation, Samsara, Gusto, Color, Grammarly, and the list goes on. There's probably a dozen or so unicorn companies in his stable. He was also a co-founder of the Advanced Energy Economy, a nationwide nonprofit, and he also sits on the board of Khan Academy. Hemant has 6 degrees from MIT, and in his spare time has also written a book called Unscaled, which describes this 30-year secular trend happening in disrupting a lot of major sectors in the economy. And Hemant's been a huge supporter for the club, for the MIT community. He's done our seed, Series A, Series B, and Series C round for the MIT AI conference over here. So thank you, Hemant, and welcome.
Glad to be here. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, great.
So I think today, over the course of the next 15, 20 minutes, we have a very short time, but I think we're going to touch base on 3 key themes. So one is this broader secular trend and shifts happening, and sort of why we can dream big, how do we keep it real? The second area where we want to talk about is sort of what is the winning formula for building great companies? And then the last thing is, how do we create a better world using technology? So let's get started. Hemant, welcome. So let's start off with the macro view. And so one of the points you make is that we're in the midst of this large secular trend and shifts happening, which will massively displace incumbents and create new opportunities for new emerging companies and disrupt traditional sectors. So I would love to get your views on what's really happening and what's your take on it.
Yeah, so if you think about the last 100 years, a lot of our focus has been on scaling up the various parts of the economy. So we scaled up our health systems, we scaled up our education system, we scaled up our corporations, our power plants, our banks, right? And it was all about trying to get basic quality of life improved and get these core services in society to be good enough. But if you think about over the course of the 100 years and at the turn of this century, every one of those systems started to break, right? The banks failed in 2008. You had power plants gave us climate change. When we scaled, corn production led to diabetes as an epidemic. You think about politics, we scaled, that has obviously been broken. So every one of these systems started to break. But at the same time, what we write about in the book is there's this technology shift happening with reorganization of society online. And so we've started looking at rethinking content, community, commerce, and now care in healthcare using online capabilities. And I think what now is happening is rather than focusing on how to do economies of scale and then bolt on some focus on the consumer, entrepreneurs today essentially say, let's focus on the consumer needs first, and then we will figure out how to rent scale because we've got the creation of all these platforms that can be leveraged. So it's a fundamental shift in going from scale versus what we call unscaled, which is focus on the consumer, on the customer. And that's blowing up the entire economy, right? I mean, if you think about the companies that get built today, and I contrast that with 20 years ago when I got into the venture business, it used to be you create software companies to make different stakeholders efficient, consumers or accountants or teachers or physicians. Now you're rethinking every one of those systems themselves. What does sort of K through 12 education look like in the future? What does insurance look like in healthcare, in life? What does modern banking look like for folks that don't have, that are not affluent versus folks that are affluent? And new companies are getting built around these segments that's unbundling off of these existing 100-year-old systems.
When you mention sort of whether it's healthcare, whether it's banking, whether it's insurance, these are highly regulated industries, right? With large incumbent players. So a new entrepreneur, fresh entrepreneur coming out of Silicon Valley, going back to sort of first principles thinking and starting off something, what can they do? How do they approach this?
Yeah, so this is an important point, right? So one of the reasons these large incumbents have a difficult time with what they call digital transformation to get ready for this next phase is because there is regulation and they are constrained in what they're able to do, and they often confuse the regulator with their customer. This happens across every regulated industry, right? What is the regulator going to think is what drives the innovation thinking. Startups over the last decade started saying, forget the regulator, and if we have to deal with the regulator someday, that's actually a good thing, which means we're relevant, and then we'll deal with it. And that ended up breaking in a lot of places. We saw the challenges Uber had and Airbnb had, and a lot of companies in healthcare that got built that were overbilling, and so on. So I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. Mm-hmm. So modern companies that get built today, now you're starting to think about, well, you can't really ignore regulation, not in terms of the way it's constructed, but the spirit of it. At the end of the day, these regulations are created to have a more successful society. And so building products, what I call minimum virtuous products, from the beginning that have the spirit of regulation built in, is important sort of dimension to building companies in the future. But you do want to be sort of consumer experience, customer experience first in how you do your product design.
Got it. So talking about product design, right? I think a big buzzword you hear all the time, and we're actually at an AI conference, is AI. Yeah. And we were having this conversation earlier where he was like, is AI even a thing? So what are your take?
Yeah.
What's your take there?
Look, if you over the last 20 years, it's gone from a web company to a mobile company to a social media company today to an AI company. Those are just, I think, investor-centric statements, and as an investor, you get trained to reverse engineer against those. So we're an AI company started popping up 3 years ago, and back then I used to always ask, so when did you start using the word AI? Because you're a 3-4-year-old company, and there was, so it's an investor-centric comment, and it actually turns me off, to be honest. There's some companies that are truly building, data science technologies. I know there's some people in the room where that is their mission. They're actually technology enablers. But most companies should be thinking about explaining their customer's problem first and foremost, as opposed to trying to position themselves as an AI company. And if not for any other reason, but for the fact that AI is garbage in, garbage out. And if you're building new workflows and new experiences, to say that you're going to invoke AI off of older data that was collected in some systems that weren't really thinking about those workflows, actually is not going to work. I mean, you see a lot of this in healthcare where there's a plethora of companies that basically say, here's all this data in EHRs and others, and we're going to use that to rethink quality of care. But that data was never collected around real-time understanding of care. It was billing data. And to say we're going to invoke AI on that and transform care, well, it's not going to happen. So I think it's just, you earn the right to be an AI company if you become built the right way in today's generation, as opposed to saying you're an AI company from the start. I do have a strong view on that.
So let's get really tactical here, right? So can you share an approach for maybe companies you've seen or others where What steps did they take early on to become really successful, and both from a company building perspective, fundraising perspective, and then setting them up for scaling it?
Yeah, so maybe I can talk about Livongo.
Yeah.
Right, so you have Amol's going to give a talk later today, who's the data scientist there, right? He's speaking here today. Yeah. So that's a company we incubated now about 6 years ago in our offices. And what Livongo started out with was, hey, managing diabetes is a hassle for everybody. There's 30 million Americans that have type 2 diabetes, and their workflow is very broken, right? They have to take readings, they have to record them, they have to go see their PCP 4 times a year. That's sort of the care protocol, essentially. And the reality is that if you're good enough to see your PCP that day, then you were probably okay that day. Diabetes is a real-time issue. So it's just the whole system was just broken. And our thought was, how do we just make it a great consumer experience for folks with diabetes? So it's easier to manage it as opposed to the way the system operates. Meanwhile, we surveyed the landscape, and there were 50 companies doing diabetes, which were all about, hey, we're going to gamify it. We're going to get people to come in and enter what they're eating and their readings and make them essentially think about their disease 10 times more in a day. Well, that's not a great experience. So we started with that mindset, built a product. There was no data at that time. That was not an AI company. And we went around saying, how do we rethink the experience and the business model to get consumers to use it? And over time, sort of 4 years later, when the company's got a fair amount of scale and is collecting a lot of data, it has now repositioned itself as an AI plus AI company, which is all about, hey, we understand the consumer in a much deeper way because we've been collecting relevant data over the last 4 or 5 years, and we can now mash it up against other sources. We can understand their data around comorbidities that we're collecting, and now we can intervene in a much more profound way than what the type 2 diabetes protocol was. So here's a company that started out as being, to me, a business model innovation and a workflow company that over time earned the right to become an AI-centric company. It's in its slice. And I think most of, when we think about these consumer experiences, you have to sort of start that way. You can't start as an AI company. You have to start as solve a real problem for the consumers or customers or businesses, whatever you're focused on, and then over time figure out how to use that data in more sophisticated ways.
Have you seen this play out in other industries like fintech, as you were mentioning, and other, whether it's with Digit or other areas?
So I think this is playing out across every one of those systems I talked about that was broken. So Digit is a company, started out as, it connects into your checking account, sort of sees basic patterns of how much money do you typically have left, when do you get paid, and then helps you just save. It'll take a couple bucks out every day out of your account and put it in a Digit account. Then it goes and starts to learn more about your credit card data, and it starts to learn about your student loan data, and it's all of a sudden it becomes this really smart system about your financial health, and it can then start to make really intelligent decisions about how much you should save, which credit card should you be, and think about the folks that are not very affluent. This is a outlier part of the world, so we don't often resonate with this problem. But in terms of most of the population, just how do they make ends meet, and it's constant optimization of where to deploy the limited resources. But if something can do that in the background because it understands you really well over time, that's valuable. So that's the evolution of that company from a simple use case to being a financial health company. Samsara is another one. We have a IoT company that's going out and essentially connecting all the sensors in the cloud, whether those sensors are GPS systems in trucks or vibration sensing in factories or computer vision systems on, are your labels being put properly on your lettuce in the companies that package lettuce. For that company, after it's gone and connected all these systems, it's collecting a lot of data about just how the industrial sector generally works. And it can start to make intelligent decisions about being preemptive and making sure your electric motors don't go down because of vibration sensing. You can start to predict, hey, this is a motor that might go down, so do predictive maintenance. So rather than having current operations protocols, you can have this connected operations capability that's much more preemptive. Same, just like the example in healthcare I was giving around, preemptive healthcare with diabetes that Livongo is trying to do. So I think that theme is going to play out across all major sectors, and there's a lot more to be done in that in that arena.
So if I summarize it, right, in the early phases, it's around workflows and optimizing those workflows, collecting the data, and then once you have enough data, then you start applying machine learning techniques to it. Now, where does, in this journey, as a startup now starts getting traction, are there points of inflection where there is a certain transition which happens, and are there any, things which come into mind, like how do they change their playbook once they have all that stuff, right?
So look, I think you have to put the foundation in from the beginning that you're truly instrumenting your business entirely from a real-time perspective. You know what's going on all the way from touching the customer to serving them to understanding what's happening with them. For every business, how much data is enough data to rethink the problem is going to be different. Right? And so that sort of depends on the industry itself. But if you're instrumenting it from the beginning and you're gaining traction, you'll know at some point when you're able to say, hey, let's now start to make decisions in a fundamentally profound way and add to the value you're adding to the customer. So it's a continuum. The other thing I would say is, as you're starting to use that data, you also want to build your products in a way that you understand the consequences of now making those intelligent decisions around the data, because it's people's health, or their financial health, or their education, or it's actual factories operating. There's like real stuff happening on the other side of this. So just making sure you're measuring the consequences of how you use those data decisions is equally important.
So that brings us to a question which is kind of like, it's similar, like, around the MIT's mission around using science and technology and applying that to create a better world. You're seeing real innovation happening right now at these early and mid-stage companies using AI and data. And so how do you think about, when you are sort of either working at these early stages, how do you build a company responsibly when you have access to so much of data and what you could do with that, right?
Yeah, so we talked about this 3 years ago, or whenever the conference started, right? Around this whole notion of responsible innovation. I think the first thing, as I was saying, was you need to design your products to understand the implications of those products long-term on society. So the metrics you're capturing in your products can't just be about what's sort of short-term growth-centric measurements and engagement with customers and whatever else. You also have to understand the way you are, making those populations of customers make decisions. Is that good for them long-term? Is that good for society long-term? So I always call that the algorithmic canaries in your products, to say, understand where you would start to your business's interests might start to diverge. And there's lots of examples of things that, in fact, I think 3 years ago, the example I gave was when Amazon had launched Amazon Prime in the Boston area. Algorithms told them not to deliver to the Roxbury neighborhood because it was not affluent enough. Well, that's not how we create services in society. We don't, differentiate, even though that was the right profitable decision. So how do you handle decisions like that? And that happens in autonomy. That happens in financial health or healthcare. So I think first thing is measuring the right way. And the second is, I think you want to build a culture where you are sort of accountable, transparent, and explainable in your approach for using AI and data. And so that there's complete understanding of what you're capturing, why you're capturing it, how you're using it, and make sure the consumer understands the trade-offs of the decisions you're giving them, as opposed to a lot of the mindset in the Valley became the whole move fast and break things mindset, which was you would sit in these meetings with founders and they almost would think of human beings on their phones as these resources they can just manipulate to do whatever. Oh yeah, we can get them to do whatever, and now let's think about how can we unleash that power for our business, as opposed to really how are we serving them well, and are we making the right decisions as opposed to abusing that power. We've seen some of that break down in the last 3 years. I think we need to learn from that and be much more intentional in the use of AI over the next couple of decades as we build these businesses.
Yeah, absolutely, especially as we're going into this next election cycle, and hopefully we don't see another example of last year's times. Last question. So what is the most, you always have like interesting ideas and sort of you have like crazy ideas. So what are like some crazy problems you think are worth solving and entrepreneurs should be working on?
Oh boy. Um, um, Look, I really mean this. I feel like a kid in a candy store because every sector's got issues. Defense needs to be rethought. It's got so much broken there. Education hasn't really been cracked. I keep saying there's no business there and it really should be done as a nonprofit, and that's why we spend time at Sal to see if that's the way to create change. But at some point there should be a business there. No one's really figured out how to rethink that. In the healthcare system, we have this huge issue that healthcare, our health systems don't run as good businesses. How do we help them be more successful? To me, this is industry-wide. I personally spent a lot of time in healthcare. I've mentioned that a few times on this talk because that's a place where I feel like we haven't really cracked it as successfully as the Valley. But autonomy has got its own set of issues. Like, how do we really bring that in? And climate change. I lost $100 million investing in climate change from 2006 to 2011 because while we were well-intentioned, the market conditions weren't correct. I feel like the society is waking up to it in a much more systemic way, and there's a whole set of problems that need to get solved there. So I'm hoping we'll start to get involved in that system a bit more as entrepreneurs. Take your pick. I think the key thing is what resonates most authentically with you. We'll work on it, but every one of these sectors needs help right now.
Well, thank you, Hemant, as always. This is great.
Thanks.
Appreciate your time.